Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched A Letter for the King. Let's talk about it. You're getting a bit of sassiness from me today because I honestly feel like with this show, I wasted a lot of my time. And that's saying something considering that we're all in quarantine anyway because the UK is in lockdown. So I'm going to be giving you guys my thoughts and my review on this Netflix series. I am going to be going through the good, I'm going to be going through the bad. Actually, I think I'm going to go through the bad first. Because there's just so much. And then hopefully we'll get into some good points, and there will definitely be spoilers in this review, so fair warning to you guys. Without further ado, let's just get right into this one. So basically the entire premise of this series, which I believe is based on some books, which I am not familiar with whatsoever, so I cannot reference them in this review, but the entire premise is centered around this boy called Churi, who's sent on this 1917-esque mission to deliver a letter to some distant king. And this letter contains some valuable information about the planned betrayal of one of the king's sons, who's some warlord, soldier, prince being who's been sent off to fight and decimate entire populations, all in the name of his father. But now the warlord prince wants to take this power for himself, and he wants to destroy everything that comes in his path, all in the name of restoring peace and bringing about the light or something. Now, the first problem that I have with the premise of this show is that this whole shtick of having to deliver a message to save lives works really well in a film like 1917, which is 2 hours-ish long, and it's a very compact story, and the suspense and the intenseness is there throughout, especially because Sam Mendes very cleverly added that extra layer of having it seem like it's one continuous shot. So as a result, it feels like you're going on this journey with the character. But in the case of this series, the momentum is completely lost because you end up with a very diluted version of this storyline where you're following along over 6 episodes, and it doesn't have that same impact. Now, it could have worked. It could have worked if we had another added layer to this basic story, just like with 1917 and its continuous shot and its great acting and performances and cinematography. In this case, we could have had these great characters to really latch onto throughout this journey that would have really added something to this story, but instead we don't quite get that. The way that the characters are drawn out in this series and their motivations is just so bad. It's so lukewarm, it's so diluted, whatever other adjectives you want to use. It's not great. It's really not great. A prime example of this is, of course, Prince Viridian. I don't know which one he's the bad one, the evil one. His motivations are opaque. We have no idea what his motivations are. We don't know what his character is actually, because we don't spend a lot of time actually getting to know this character and his origins and why it is that he thinks the way that he does at this point in time when we meet him. There are so many questions surrounding this character, like who, what, when, where. It doesn't make any sense because throughout the series I fully expect them to kind of delve into why it is that he thinks this way, what exactly he's talking about in the first place, because his literal only explanation is, I want to defeat the darkness because of a destiny, because of some random prophecy. Like I'm over that. I am so over that trope. I am so over that type of story. Like I don't even want to see. Oh, and the fact that it's done so poorly here, and the fact that the world building is so weak, it just makes it so much worse that we have to deal with yet another The One storyline. And then on the other side of the forest, you have the young knights, the baby knights, if you will. And we'll get to the individual characters later on when I deal with them individually. But just in terms of the actual plot, as we're discussing the story here, one of the major plot points throughout this show that I kept thinking about every single time I saw them, and really that was all I could think about every single time I saw them because they were the weakest parts of this show for a lot of it. But one of the biggest plot holes is that the bad guys want to get a hold of this letter. Churi has managed to get the 6th letter, which the bad guys don't want the king to have, so that he'll find out about the betrayal and the treachery and the blah blah blah. So they're trying their very hardest. They're bringing out the Red Riders, they're bringing out the best of the group to try and get Churi. Except that doesn't work on multiple occasions, and actually Churi's father, Sir Churi, ends up dying right before his eyes because Armin's father kills him in his attempt to get this 6th letter. But then in his infinite genius, he decides instead of pursuing this guy himself and getting the best of the best on his team to get this sixth letter, he sends off a bunch of amateurs, a bunch of amateur children. He himself admits that his son isn't the brightest bulb. He isn't the smartest of the bunch, if you will, to put it lightly. He says it in way worse terms. And yet he sends him off with his group of friends and the baby knights, basically, to go and find Cheery and get this all important letter. It makes no sense whatsoever. And then you have the Lavinia plot point where Cheery ends up stumbling across her as he tries to get the letter to the king, and she ends up being a far more important character than we first anticipated, because guess what? All of these magical powers that Cheery thought he had actually belong to her, and the voices that he was hearing in his head, which by the way, yeah, he was hearing voices in his head. Did I mention that? It doesn't matter. Anyways, he was hearing those voices because they were trying to guide him towards her, which I think, first of all, doesn't make sense if you take into account that whole scene in the monastery when the guy is trying to tell him to like hone his powers, and he's like, okay, I'm gonna hone in my power. Like, if they were her powers, how come that reformed murderer said that he could sense some power within him, or he could sense something within him? Maybe he was sensing it within her instead. I don't know. But essentially, my biggest issue when it comes to that whole plot twist that was supposed to be really surprising, but actually I kind of saw coming, because this is like a kids show, like of course I saw it coming. But the biggest issue I have with it is that whilst it could have been a really cool twist, it doesn't work, because for a lot of the show we are following Cheery on this very archetypical, you know, hero the one quest to deliver this letter, and we are convinced for a lot of the show, at least if you're following along and not actually thinking about what you're watching, you are convinced that he's the one with the powers. So in the end, when the prince gets defeated, it would have been so much more rewarded if it were him, because we've been following him on his journey. It doesn't really work as well because she ends up being the person with the powers, but we don't really know her as well as we've gotten to know Cheery. There's a reason why the people that we follow on these stories are the ones with the powers, are the chosen ones, because at the end of the day we become more invested in them as the hero, at least if they're charismatic, which this guy is not, and we'll talk about that again later on. But just in terms of the story structure, it really doesn't make sense to have her be the heroine, because we're not really invested in her, and they don't actually make the effort to refocus the story onto her. Instead, they choose to keep her as a peripheral character, even though we find out that she's the one that we're supposed to be paying attention to, not him, and we don't find out much about her even after that revelation is made. And then she goes off and disappears into the woods, and we don't see her until the very end, where she shows up out of nowhere and saves the day in the most anticlimactic ending to anything, to a show, to a film, to an advert that I have ever seen. So in the end, instead of feeling surprised and empowered by that plot twist, I ended up feeling cheated and like I've just been ripped off, because all that time I spent with Cheery ultimately was for nothing. Alright, so now let's just dive into the characters, because clearly I have a lot to say about them. So overall, just in general, when it comes to these characters, especially the younger ones, I want to say that I'm not doubting the acting ability of these actors. I really think that with better direction and better writing and really just a better project, they would have done so much better. Like, they would have been so much better. I think that they definitely had potential here, especially the guy that plays Cheery. Like, oh, and we'll get to him right now, I guess. He is such an uncharismatic, boring character. It's painful to watch. And the thing is, at the beginning they make it very clear that they want him to be the entire opposite of what you or I would predict a hero to be. He's not very good with the sword, he's not a great fighter, he doesn't have those archetypical hero-like characteristics to him, and that's supposed to kind of lead to him having these unique characteristics, these different characteristics that make him a very unique hero at the very end. At least that's what you think going into it. Like, you can see the puppet string things at work there. But that's not what happens, because the character never becomes interesting. He never does get these really cool and really powerful, unique skills that, even though he may not be the best fighter, make him a very valuable leader and a very interesting hero to follow on this journey. Now, I personally fully respect and understand having a protagonist who is more quietly intelligent, who doesn't have, the loudest voice in the room, who isn't as boisterous as some of the other archetypical heroes that we've gotten in lore in the past. But this character doesn't bring anything. You don't have to have the loudest voice in the room to have something really interesting to say, but this character has nothing interesting to say. He spent a lot of the series just gaping and in confusion and it drives me insane, because I think, again, there's so much potential there with that actor. I'm sure that he could do so much better with better material given to him. And the thing is that the show kind of knows this, like it almost already knows that the character that it has isn't that great. So then at the very end, it has the knights who throughout the entire series pretty much were against him and wanted to hand him over to the bad guys to pretty much die even. The show has them be the ones to say, actually, you are a great hero. Even though you may not have these powers, you are very worthy of being a knight and being our leader. What? Why? How? First of all, again, I must reiterate, they were against him pretty much the entire time. How are they then flipping and reversing their outlook on him and saying that he would have been a great leader? Since when? And then secondly, they don't even know him. For the majority of the show, they are chasing after him. So they haven't actually spent a lot of time with him. And the time that they did spend with him and actually gain some respect for him, they thought that he had powers. That was the majority of the time they spent together, with them thinking that he was special with these powers. And so the idea that all of a sudden, having just found out that he doesn't have them, they would automatically say, well, yeah, but you're still a good leader. Out where? How? Especially because it comes from Armin, who's like his biggest bully. Like, it, no. Now let's get on to the actual baby knights themselves. Now, first of all, this show wants to have its cake and eat it too, because when it comes to this whole world, you have these protagonists who are very young, and again, I get it because it's like a kid's show, but then you also have these random acts of violence, like intense acts of violence, even though there's no like actual blood and it's not quite as vivid and visceral as it could be if it was like an R-rated show. But there's some intense things going on. Like I said, Churi's stepfather ends up dying in front of him, like right before his eyes, and he barely has any time to cry before he's running for his life. And then you have the fact that at the end of the series, one of the baby knights ends up dying. Like, Giuseppe just ends up dying. What? So this show goes from having these baby knights have a snowball fight whilst they're captured by the Red Riders to one of them actually being killed by the hands of the Red Riders. Like, there's such a disconnect there that it really, the audience of this show just becomes so unclear. And also, speaking of Giuseppe, can we talk about that brief romance that he started with Foldo literally the night before that he died? Can we talk about that for a second? Because again, over here, I often say I am pro LGBTQ representation in films and TV shows and media in general, but we have to do it some justice, and that romance came out of nowhere. And yeah, they definitely had that kind of frenemy dynamic between them throughout the series, and in any other show that may have translated to a sexual tension type situation. But again, in this show, it really doesn't. It makes no sense. It comes out of nowhere. And whilst we're on the topic of romance, there's two other romances here that I really didn't care for. Churi and Lavinia, they have a thing, and that was so cringe. That kiss was so cringe-worthy. I could not even watch it. I literally closed my laptop. I couldn't even watch it. It was so cringe. They have no chemistry together at all. Maybe as friends, but as people who are actually in love, no, absolutely not. And then you have the Queen with Prince Viridian or Iridian, or whichever one that he is, the good one, and that was just so superfluous to the story. Like, why was that there? I don't understand. To make a statement about the political situation when it comes to the royal families, perhaps, but I'm not investing at all in the royal families, so it just made no sense to have it in this show. Alright, I feel like I've gotten all of my qualms, all of my issues when it comes to this show out of the way, so let's get into some of the good points, shall we? I definitely think that there are some positives when it comes to this series. First and foremost, I'm a little bit on the fence about including it in this section of the review, actually, because on the one hand, it's a bad thing, on the other, it's a good. But I do want to point out that the actual MVP of this series wasn't any of the baby knights, it wasn't Churi. It was actually the horse. That horse, I'll put the name of the horse over here, but that horse was fantastic. Loved the horse. Now, again, on the negative side of things, this horse was a deus ex machina if I ever did see one. Because the entire purpose, the entire role of this horse throughout the entire series is to show up in the moment that Churi needs him, just when you think all hope is lost. But at the same time, I don't want to hold it against the horse too much because he actually had so much more charisma and so much more personality than a lot of the human characters. Speaking of personality, a human character that I actually think had quite a bit of it was the character of Piak. He's the younger brother of Giuseppe who ends up tagging along on this journey. And I very much felt that he was one of the only characters in this show that kind of fit in to the premise and also to the, target audience. It made sense to have this character there as a sort of looking glass for the younger audiences that are probably going to be drawn towards this show. Another character that I'm somewhat on the fence about, but mostly positive about, is Iona. Now, she is the only female baby knight, and at first I actually really enjoyed this character. I liked her gumption, I liked her attitude, I liked the fact that she just got things done and didn't faff around like the rest of them. But then she does end up betraying the team and siding with the Red Riders. I actually think they did that pretty well because they were hinting towards it, and then when it actually happened, it happened in a moment where you thought that they were very comfortable as a team, including her, and then she just turns on them and it feels like a true betrayal, but at the same time it doesn't come out of nowhere because we know she had that interaction with the Red Rider leader. And I love the fact that the Red Rider leader pretty much reluctantly adopted her. But the problem with this betrayal is that you end up with this team of baby knights who are just infinitely less interesting than they were even with her in it, and that was already a tough time to watch. So that was my only issue, is that when she left a gaping hole. And also, I wasn't the biggest fan of the fact that they replaced the only female character within the Baby Knights with Lavinia, essentially. So it was kind of like, we can't have two girls in this team. So one's going to turn evil and the other one's going to be the powerful one. Also, speaking of Lavinia, her father's played by Andy Serkis, which was very surprising. I was like, Andy Serkis, what are you doing here? But it made sense as soon as I did some Googling and realised that Andy Serkis' daughter actually plays Lavinia on the show. So I was like, oh, it's nepotism, fine, that makes sense. But at the same time, this is going to sound really harsh, but I did feel like seeing Andy Serkis there reminded me of what good acting looks like. Oh, it sounds so bad, but it's true, because throughout the show I was like, maybe it's not as bad as I think. Like, maybe I'm just in a bad mood or I'm giving it a harsh time. But then he appears and just steals every single scene that he's in, and I'm like, oh no, it's not just me. He's just that great, and this is just that bad. In terms of some other positives, I will say that this show is at times very beautifully shot. There are some very beautiful aerial shots in here that really make you appreciate the world that they're trying to build, even though the story itself doesn't do a good job of it. Speaking of the land though, they do very much utilize the same 10 acres of land for a lot of the forest scenes, especially as just like a cost-cutting measure, I guess, but it's quite noticeable. So overall, I would say that the show's not the worst thing on Netflix. It certainly isn't the worst thing on Netflix. No, definitely not. It's actually somehow better than the sum of its parts, but not by much. And actually, if I really think about what else is on offer on Netflix, at least in the UK, the first thing that comes to mind is Merlin, which is a CBBC show that was very, very popular in the time of airing, and I discovered much, much later. It's actually a really, really cool show. And this show has so much more in terms of, budget and what it's able to do with the choreography of the fighting and the cinematography and everything, that you would expect it to be better than Merlin. But it really isn't. Like, Merlin just has those character dynamics. It has those excellent performances from those actors that you follow throughout the 7, I think, series. And it just makes it so much better as a result to follow the journey of these characters that you become so invested in. So with all of that said, I'm going to give A Letter for the King a 5 out of 10. So that's it from me. Now that I've told you guys my thoughts on A Letter for the King, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of the series down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really, really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!